Hello, this is Connor Stoops and welcome back to another Lumion Legacy HTUC video, and today's video is on Moreel. Moreel is a pretty unique Lumion in this metagame and has a lot of varying matchups that it can take advantage of, which makes it a pretty good Lumion. So let's talk about that. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to use and counter Moreel, from the counters and checks in teammates in order to use Moreel in battles, as well as using sets and role knowledge in order to build around Moreel. Today's video is all about how to use and counter Moreel. So the role that Moreel is going to be playing in your matches is a pretty simple question to answer, and we can answer this with its base stats. Its base stats for the most part are pretty simple, with its speed tier being its most damning attribute. You are going to be get outsped by multiple walls such as Obsidian, Cinemars, and Gargoyle Defense, and unless your name is Waka Waka, Moreel is going to be getting undersped by pretty much any offensive Lumion in the game. You do have a decent range defense stat of 76 though. While this isn't the best of the range defense stats, it is still a pretty decent range defense to have, especially when you disclude your energy stat here and you move on to its HP stat of 105. This does somewhat patch up your range defense, and of course that melee defense at 104. This makes it so Moreel can actually tank many melee hits and can check many of the melee attackers in this metagame. So Moreel has that niche, and it does have a pretty good range attack stat of 121. While this isn't on par with the likes of Valkyrie, Ikizune, Shachi, Soulburst, Eruptodon, it does have the ability with setup and coverage to be able to hit things pretty hard and threaten things out. So it's definitely not a bad range attack stat to have. So what's the role that Moreel is going to be playing? Well, first off, it's going to be having a pretty good wall breaking potential. If you try to run offensive sets with Moreel, it probably will perform well because I'll explain later, it does have pretty good matchups against certain walls. And of course, you do have a pretty good melee defense, which will actually let you tank hits from melee attackers and check melee attackers pretty well, which I'll talk about later and as mentioned previously. But with his speed tier, this does let it be able to be prone to revenge killing. Of course, pairing pivots, baffles, whatever you want with Moreel will help its speed tier, but its speed tier is going to be making Moreel a pretty ineffective Lumion when it comes to the end game. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the sets for Moreel. So, because our speed stat is pretty low, we're not going to be utilizing it. Instead, we're going to be utilizing a bulky offensive set, which will be utilized to break walls and check offensive Lumions that we can check. Our ability of choice is Luck of the Sea. This is also because it's our only viable ability and will also help us not get stalled out by Lumions such as Venilin, basically anything that statuses and poisons, status drops from charades. They're not going to be affecting us, baffles as well, so Luck of the Sea seems pretty good for Moreel. But you do have a personality with very smart. This will let you be able to hit as hard as possible, and while you can run robust smart variants, typically your defenses and HP investment, which I'll talk about in a bit, will be enough to tank hits on the melee side. And of course, Frail Sluggish decreases stats we're not going to be using. However, your moveset will be energized. It's pretty much needed here so you can break ranged walls and increase your damage output. Landslide is here as extra coverage and will help us defeat fire types and earth types that are able to get super effectively hit by this. Mainly, it's only Dokomori and Tyrex. And your 2 stabs with Thunderstrike and Shadow Lurk, this is pretty simple. And of course, the TPs. I forgot to mention the item here, but of course, run Health Amulet. And your TPs here may seem pretty complicated, but this is pretty simple. With your energy stat of 36, this does let you use 5 Shadow Lurks and 1 Energize, so this is pretty good. 200 range attack stat for maximum damage, and your 200 HP and 8 melee defense lets you live a 4-hit KO, or lets you get a 4-hit KO on Obsidians after a 1 layer of barbs, and without 1 layer of barbs, of course, it's doing much less. And your speed stat here of 24 lets you outspeed 0 speed sluggish bar blasts which if you didn't know, you'll be able to 1v1 and kill this thing now. And of course, your ranged defense stat of 32 is leftovers, but this also lets you live let 2 hits from a non-invested high explosive water bomb from Bar Blast. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the offensive counters and checks and the teammates for Moreel. So offensive counters and checks, they're pretty simple here because like I said, its speed tier is going to be a detriment for this thing. Basically anything offensive and can hit this thing super effectively, like the fire types, Chironics, the water types like Deladrix, and ice types like Nova Diaz and Glaciadia, they're going to be able to do a lot against this Lumion. What's also pretty tough about these Lumions though is that these Lumions can't be swapping in on Moreel, mainly because Moreel has the coverage to hit everything back here super effectively with the exception of Chironics. Of course, its defensive counters and checks, it's also going to be a big detriment to this thing. Even though after a +1 energize, it can still able to hit KO Lumions such as Pyrolin and somewhat Chironics, but because of its speed tier, Pyrolin will be able to outlast it because it does have access to Rejuvenate, so it can rejuvenate on the swap, hit it again, and Peace of Mind Rejuvenate because it does have the speed advantage. So even if you 2-hit KO Pyrolin, Pyrolin will still be able to beat you because it does have Rejuvenate and is faster than you. Harvestect is actually pretty much the best counter or check to Moreel, mainly because it does resist all of its coverage moves pretty easily. Gargolem Defense, this doesn't do much to Moreel back, but this does set up barbs on it and driving forces it out, so this is pretty good for it. And Chironics here, Chironics doesn't really, you have to run very clever sets in order to able to stop Moreel, but overall Chironics is something that can stop it. And for your offensive and defensive teammates, let's talk about the offensive ones first. So if you notice the trend, water types is going to be a very good teammate for Moreel, mainly because they can stop the fire types, or not the fire types, but mainly because it can break through most of Moreel's matchups such as Harvestect, Gargolem Defense, Pyrolin, Jelusa being the main one here, and even both forms of Dakuda. Deladrix is also a pretty good answer, and if you're running more offensive teams and like very frail offensive teams, Pransu will also be a good teammate for Moreel. And finally, defensive teammates, Luminami, Pyrolin, Cleone, Dokomori, it's the standard pretty good Lumions that can just check all around. Fire and ice types, most of them won't be able to touch Pyrolin at all, so this is pretty good for you. Cleone sets up screens, so Moreel can actually benefit a lot from it, and even though it won't be able to benefit much from near enchantments, it will definitely benefit from far enchantments because of its low range defense stat. Dokomori here, it doesn't really have the best matchups against ice types because they hit it super effectively, but very clever Dokomoris will be able to somewhat deal with the fire types and of course set up hazards, help be able to chip the walls, and of course baffle into Moreel. Luminami is also just an overall support. Very clever or robust Luminamis, they will be able to take hits from deep freezes, so that is also something to take note of. As of course, using other pivots such as Yursnak and Icicle, they also work well with this Lumion, so don't be limited to these guys. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the conclusion and my thoughts on Moreel. So if you were there for my stream, basically, you would know my thoughts on Moreel, but just to sum it up here, I think Moreel is a pretty solid Lumion in what it can actually do. I've only mentioned previously on what it can actually break, but Moreel can work as a pretty good teammate to stop Lumions such as Obsidian and Barblast. It also does have the advantage here against other Lumions such as Venilin. Venilin basically can't touch this thing besides bartering it, which won't really matter because you are pretty slow anyway. Luck of the Sea basically just helps this thing so much. You can also break Lumions such as Gasstroke, if I recall, because Gasstroke can't poison you, so you do have the setup advantage against it. And overall, Moreel just seems to be a pretty good Lumion. There is one problem that I have with Moreel generally, and that's its speed tier. So Moreel is going to be focused on more defensive, more bulky offensive teams, and maybe it will probably appear in some semi-stall balanced teams. But overall, I think Moreel is a pretty solid Lumion in this metagame. While it's definitely not going to be one of the best Lumions in this metagame, like just based off of what's actually been here, I think Moreel will still have a solid niche in this place. So, if you liked the video, then of course, like and subscribe. You can get more Atlantean City Part 2 content, which will be coming out soon. My videos will be slowing down more because I have more stuff to do, but don't worry about that because every Atlantean Part 2 Lumion will be able to get a video. This is Connor Stoops signing off to remind you that Zulong is still a dumpster fire.